Well, let me get started. Apologizing first that we're having technical difficulties with some of our people who are supposed to be here. But I would like to welcome you to our session, Detours, Police Terror and Resistance on Jim Crow Era Roadways. My name is Pete Daniel, and when I heard about this session on automobiles, I thought back that from Thunder Road to early stock car racing to Easy Rider, road and track have always suggested danger. Cars changed the face of the southern landscape, not only increased the freedom and mobility provided, but also Jim Crow restrictions. While the Mississippi Highway Patrol might resemble antebellum slave patrols, at the same time, imprisoned black women found that reaching the highway might offer escape from bloodhounds, while SNCC workers reported often on highway harassment. Our panelists today complicate the highway as a site both of violence and of freedom. For the people who are attending, you can register your questions on the Q&A function or on chat, and we will address them at the end of the panel. Our aim is to present talking points that provoke discussion, so the presentations, I trust, will be brief. And now I'll pause to see how our panelists are getting along gaining access. Any reports?
Hello, everyone. So I'm on the phone with Katherine. I've gotten the very helpful tech support people in the conference working with us too. I'm guessing that Kat is in the same boat, but we're working in the background. So, up to you, Pete. Micah, if you're ready to go, I think you could go, and then I'll just keep working here.
Well, first I could introduce the panelists.
Excellent.
And that'll give us a little more time to get the people in. So let me introduce the panelists. Katherine Bynum is Assistant Professor of History at Arizona State University. She completed her PhD in the summer of 2020 at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. She is currently working on her manuscript in progress, Civil Rights in the City of Hate, Grassroots Organizing Against Police Brutality in Dallas, which focuses on activists' quest to end racist policing practices through the civil rights and Black-brown power movements. Micah Khater is a PhD candidate in the Department of African American Studies and History at Yale University, where she is completing her dissertation, Unable to Find Any Trace of Her, Black Women, Genealogies of Escape in Alabama Prisons 1920 to 1950, which is a cultural and social history of Black women who ran away from prisons, police, and jails in Alabama during the early 20th century. More broadly, her research interests lie at the intersection of Black women's history, carceral studies, disability studies, and Black feminist theory. Justin Randolph is Assistant Professor of History at Texas State University. He specializes in 19th and 20th century U.S. social and political history. His primary research concerns the intersection of policing and inequality in the American South. His first book, Mississippi Law, The Long Crisis of Policing and Reform in America's Black Countryside, is under advanced contract with the University of North Carolina Press. There, Randolph chronicles Black resistance to white supremacist policing and police reform in rural Mississippi between the dawn of Jim Crow and the onset of mass incarceration. His broader interests include oral history, public history, agricultural history, social movements, capitalism, and historical memory. William Sturkey is Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he researches and teaches the history of race in the American South. He is the co-editor of To Write the Light of Freedom, the newspapers of the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Schools, and author of Hattiesburg, an American City in Black and White. Charron is Associate Professor of History at NC State University. She teaches courses in U.S., African American, Southern, and women's and gender history. She is currently working on a book about Black women and Black power in the rural northeastern North Carolina. Most of us know her as the author of Teacher, The Life of Septima Clark. Well, we have now part of our panel. We're missing the first presenter. So we have to sort of improvise here. Is there any progress on whether Katherine Bynum is going to be with us, or is having additional problems, or is it being worked on? Justin, are you on top of that?
As best I can be, I am on top of that. I would say Kat appearing under Katherine Bynum's name is not a great sign.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
I don't know how to change the name.
On other things, you can click on it and have a name change. I don't know if that works here. If you click on your name, and then it offers you options to rename.
Yeah.
It may not work on this program. Oh, Katherine Bynum is with us. Welcome. Just in time. Can you hear me okay, Katherine?
Yes, just 1 second. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
There are two of you. We won't worry about that right now. I've already introduced everybody, Katherine, so
Okay.
you're up.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're up. You ready to go?
Yes, if you don't mind just giving me 1 second to pull up my notes. It's right here on my computer. I apologize. I have no idea what was going on with the login process earlier, but you know what? We'll make it work. It's okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry about this. Just give me 1 second. This is what I was hoping to do whenever we got everything set up. There we go. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. It's great to be here. And again, my apologies for the technical difficulties. I spent a good 30 minutes yesterday trying to figure it all out and was furiously texting Justin that I had a bad feeling that something like this was going to happen. But anyway, we're here. So let me just go ahead and get started. What I'll be presenting on today is part of my second and third chapter of my manuscript in progress, which discusses the rise of Black power in Dallas, as well as some of the seeds of multiracial coalition building. And I'm doing this through the lens of the Dallas chapter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which formed in Dallas in 1967 by Dallas native Ernest McMillan. So first, what I want to do is start with a little bit of context, both at the local and national level, before moving into some of the broader themes of this panel. So SNCC was founded in 1960 as a civil rights organization dedicated to registering voters, engaging in student-led sit-in demonstrations, and just generally ending Jim Crow segregation and disfranchisement. By the late 1960s, National SNCC Chairman Stokely Carmichael had iterated his cries for Black power in Mississippi and had closely aligned the party with the newly formed Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which had formed in Oakland, California in 1966. So liberals and conservatives alike associated Black power to violence that fostered riots and crime. And as a result, federal and local policing agencies surveilled Black power organizations, hoping that their policing tactics would diminish episodes of rebellion and ultimately the power of Black militancy. And so the FBI began targeting SNCC's activities under its counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, after the numerous urban rebellions in 1967. But the Dallas SNCC chapter was operating under these kinds of surveillance constraints. So in Dallas, the situation was actually particularly a little bit more intense, as the city remained concerned with improving its image after President John F. Kennedy's assassination in 1963. The city, after that event, the city became nationally known as this conservative, fundamentalist, business-controlled metropolis, where ultra-conservative figures like Bruce Alger and Joe Poole and retired General Edwin Walker and others pushed the city farther to the right by espousing this kind of fearful and conspiratorial paranoia of alleged communists working within the government. And so after JFK's assassination, the nation had actually dubbed Dallas the city of hate, right? Alluding to this idea that this ultra-conservative organizing had cultivated this general tolerance of violence and bigotry that ultimately led Lee Harvey Oswald to pull the trigger. And so this, in turn, led the city of Dallas to really crack down on any type of disturbance, public disturbance, because they wanted to rebuild their image as not the city of hate, but the city of excellence. So contrary to popular assumptions, SNCC's activism in Dallas had closely mirrored the activism of previous civil rights organizations. All had pressed the city for political representation, economic viability and autonomy, and an end to police brutality. SNCC differed, though, in that Ernest McMillan and other members refused to placate to white demands and were unafraid of overtly challenging the racism of the Dallas power structure. So instead of using backdoor negotiations or nonviolent protests, SNCC used confrontation, right? Challenging not only those white ideas of respectable Black protests, but also the spatial constraints of Jim Crow segregation that still controlled Black mobility in the city. So after two failed attempts to organize alongside Bishop College, which was a local HBCU in the city, as well as the Nation of Islam, McMillan reached out to the local SDS chapter at Southern Methodist University in August of 1967. And together, SNCC and SDS initially worked on draft counseling, right? Finding ways for young men to avoid conscription into the Vietnam War. And doing so, in political officials' minds, this threatened really the security of the United States. So federal investigators working under COINTELPRO furnished the names, the addresses, license plates, all this information of both SNCC and SDS members to the Dallas Police Department. And so after he starts working with SDS, McMillan really remembers a lot of the frequent harassment he faced on the streets from the police, where he said, quote, standing on the street corner was considered loitering and distributing literature was considered trespassing, end quote. And so police had also been known to tap their phones, to falsely arrest them, oftentimes would try to plant drugs or weapons on SDS or SNCC members. And this harassment ended up being so intense that a few weeks into this process, the SDS chapter on SMU's campus voted to officially disband. They were like, we're out. This is way too intense. And so a lot of the members stopped organizing within SDS, but others continued on in much more unofficial ways and continued working with SNCC. So here is where I'd like to emphasize where my presentation intersects with our panel's theme, right? Police terror and resistance on Jim Crow era roadways. So police and political terror and harassment had officially dismantled SDS on SMU, and it had already worked against SNCC, who were frequently arrested for passing out those political flyers in public spaces. But police interaction with these groups intensified after three really important events. So the first one was a demonstration protesting anti-Black police violence in front of the Dallas County Courthouse, which is located downtown. So in March of 1968, Ernest McMillan read aloud on the steps of the county courthouse. He said, quote, "In order to stop the unjustified murder of Black men by racist police, the community should rise up and kill 10 racist cops for every Black man unjustly killed," end quote. So that is a very provocative statement that was broadcast on live television, right? And what this broadcast ends up doing is really two things. It brings a lot more Black residents into the SNCC organization. They saw that broadcast and were inspired by it and wanted to join SNCC. But it also helped increase the types of surveillance and police harassment that they were under at that time, including federal and local police. So this was a national effort as well. The second event involved what came to be known as the food smashing raid at the OK Supermarket. The OK Supermarket was a white-owned grocery store that was located in Black neighborhoods of South Dallas. So on July 1st of 1968, 30 Black activists working with SNCC showed up at the OK Supermarket and began filling up grocery carts of like ice cream, particular cuts of meat, and abandoned those carts in random aisles throughout the store. A few hours later, the protest they realized hadn't necessarily gotten the store's attention, so they decided to be more provocative. So they moved back into the store and began destroying food items onto the shelf. They dropped fruit from their crates and stepped on tomatoes and broke cantaloupes and watermelons. And Ernest McMillan went to the refrigerated section of the store and picked up a milk bottle and dropped it. And I like to call this the milk bottle that broke that you could hear around the world, right? Like this was the ultimate sin that he could have done. So as the organizer of this boycott and as the protest, Ernest McMillan was arrested and charged with felony destruction of private property worth more than $200. So even though he only broke this milk bottle, he was held responsible for all the other damage that was done inside the store. He was found guilty in August of 1968, but was released on appeal in early 1968. So he only spent a couple of months in jail. But while he awaited trial, the city passed an ordinance directed specifically at that type of organizing, right? Because they are absolutely fearful about what SNCC is doing and how it could absolutely further tarnish their image, right? So they passed something called the Anti-Riot Ordinance, which was any type of information that they would receive from the chief of police, the mayor could declare a state of emergency of a public disturbance. And they define this very loosely as any riot, affray, noise, disturbance, or disorderly assembly in any public or private place within the city. So basically doing this, the city is like freaked out, right? They don't want any more disturbances happening. They're worried that if McMillan continues to organize and stage more food smashing raids or worse, that the city could explode into the rebellion. And so the anti-riot ordinance allows them to put the proper procedures in place to prevent that from happening. And so the third event happens a couple of months later, November 25th in 1968. And this occurs alongside the local chapter of the National Welfare Rights Organization, which was led by a Black woman named Ruth Jefferson, who was also a member of SNCC. So they staged a 60-hour sit-in at the downtown welfare offices after the Texas Department of Public Welfare cut AFDC benefits down to $123 a month, which was well below the poverty rate. So SNCC attended the demonstration with the welfare mothers as protectors, and sympathetic white students from SMU, many of whom were SDS members, protested outside carrying signs that defended these mothers in their protest. And so these three events, right, increase the kinds of police attention on SNCC as well as Ruth Jefferson and what kinds of harassment they endured on the streets. So SNCC was really split amongst two factions. There was one safe house in South Dallas where McMillan lived, and another safe house at Ruth Jefferson's apartment in the West Dallas housing project. Police regularly harassed SNCC members en route, going to and from Jefferson's and McMillan's, pulling them over and searching them, finding things like obscene literature, marijuana, weapons, etc. Whatever they wanted to find, they were going to find. And through the SDS underground newspaper, SNCC members reported that between January 1969 and May 1969, police arrested SNCC members a total of 31 times. And so they were really aiming at trying to destroy this group by just hitting them with all of these different arrests, all of these different attorneys' fees, etc., etc. Police also raided their homes. So April 27th, 1969, they raided the apartment of Ernest McMillan, who lived with his wife Felicia, and fellow SNCC members Ed and Jackie Harris, who are a married couple. The whole building had been surrounded, and they were forced to exit, some of whom were naked and not allowed to dress. McMillan was charged with purchasing a carbine rifle and violating the Gun Control Act of 1967. So, excuse me, SNCC used whatever means they could to avoid this abuse by the Dallas police. Charles Beasley and Fahim Minka created a police patrol called the Kakatayari, which means brothers ready in Swahili. They followed police cars in Black neighborhoods, taking pictures and making recordings of police officers' behavior when making arrests, something not so dissimilar that we're seeing today. Sometimes organizers used caravans to transport members from one safe house to another for meetings or protests or gatherings. According to McMillan and others, this made it hard for police to know who was in what car, and therefore they weren't able to pull over the exact car that they were looking for. SNCC also used a relationship with the SDS. They had the underground newspaper called the Dallas Notes to propagate the types of harassment that they faced. So they were able to show the differences in the type of treatment that SNCC organizers were dealing with versus what white criminals were dealing with at that time. And they also built coalitions, right? This is one of the major focuses of my manuscript. SNCC had already done so with SDS, but Ruth Jefferson, who had become a member of SNCC as well, used her connections with the local War on Poverty Board. She was hired there as a community organizer in October of 1969. And when officials tried to fire her because of her previous work with the sit-in demonstration at the welfare offices, Black and Brown power groups who had both worked with Jefferson on the War on Poverty backed her and supported her when she was being investigated by the War on Poverty Board. So this coalition ends up becoming the multiracial coalition that continues on into the 1970s when the city is battling police violence after 18-year-old Michael Moorhead's 1970 murder by Dallas police, as well as 12-year-old Santos Rodriguez's murder by the same Dallas police officer who had killed Michael Moorhead. So this is where I'll leave you, and we can get on to the next presenter. So thank you so much for hearing me out.
Thank you. Micah.
Thank you so much. It was great to hear your work, Katherine. And I will take us back a little bit in time to the 1930s and 1940s and also shift us in geopolitical space to Alabama. So as Pete mentioned in his introduction of me, in my larger project, I'm telling a social and cultural history of incarcerated Black women who ran away from prisons, police, and jails in early 20th century Alabama. And so when I was in the archives in 2018 and 2019, I had been going through these escape notices for several weeks. There were different ways that prisons reported escape, but I began to come across a genre that I hadn't seen before. And I noticed that suddenly in these reports, wardens or deputy wardens were forced to type a new phrase, one that I hadn't seen before, which was often, in a general sense, the dogs tracked her and to the highway and were unable to track her any further. So first of all, dogs loom large in my project. And that is in large part because I examine how dog hunting patrols were an intergenerational tool of white surveillance that survived the abolition of slavery and also are transmogrified in the burgeoning carceral state. And as we know from historiographies of slavery, dogs were extremely effective at tracking people down. And similarly, prison wardens sent dogs into the brush, the rivers, along the dusty roads, and eventually into the cities that neighbored the county where the prisons were, in the kind of middle part of Alabama. And so I know when I was coming across this new genre in the archive that I already had known that incarcerated Black women had long been contending with dogs as vicious components of carceral surveillance. But then these escape notices from the early 1940s prompted me to think about roads. And I wanted to ask the question and answer the question of how technology could both be commandeered by incarcerated Black women and also be this mechanism by which white supremacist surveillance is evolving and responding to nascent efforts to run away. And so I went back and I realized, okay, I do have something as early as 1934. So there's a 22-year-old woman named Gertrude Feeling who is incarcerated at Wetumpka State Penitentiary. It's May, and she's forced to chop cotton in a nearby field. And she goes up to one of the guards and she says, I need to go into the woods for what she says nature purposes. And then she runs. And as during slavery, dog packs were ambulatory, meaning that some prisons housed stockades and others did not. So before actually running after Gertrude Feeling, the warden had to call for the dogs at Draper Prison and wait about half an hour for them to come. But once they arrived, the dogs, of course, pick up Feeling's scent. They follow her as she crossed elevated terrain for nearly an hour, moving south and east toward the roads. But then just at the cusp of the Montgomery and Wetumpka Highway, she was recaptured. And so after this escape in 1934, it's not until the mid-1940s in the archive that I began to see a consistent pattern of incarcerated Black women's attempts to use the highway to fracture this continuity between prison surveillance and the antebellum past. And so I began to think about why this might be. And I think it's in part because of the massive expansion of roads and highways that took place between the 1930s and 1940s. So in the mid-1930s, when Gertrude Feeling runs away, the Alabama state system of roads had only existed for a decade. And around the time of her escape, there was just one state highway that connected Montgomery, the capital, and Wetumpka, and Montgomery was the nearest big city to the prison. And then just gravel roads were tracing the town south of Wetumpka. But then by the mid-1940s, major paving projects were underway in Montgomery County through state legislation like the Farm to Market Road Act, which promised that no farm would be more than 4 miles from pavement. And if we're thinking about rural carceral space, we might think too about how no prison was possibly more than 4 miles from pavement. But then it's not just the roads, right? Because that lays a necessary foundation, but it also has to be the number of cars. And so we see by the 40s that the number of cars and commercial trucks operating on the highways mark this shift in incarcerated people's ability to find or coordinate rides. Because in 1936, so that's just 2 years after Feeling attempted to get to the road to escape, Alabama had the lowest per capita car ownership of any state in the country. And we also know during earliest years of the Depression, some people lost their cars. They weren't able to afford them anymore. And so in this time period, whereas 1 in 5 people nationwide owned cars, only 1 in 12 in Alabama did. And so as traffic increased, so does the opportunity to hitch a ride or be picked up. And so we know that between 1935 and 1940 in Alabama, car ownership changes drastically. So around 1940, the registration of cars and trucks increased by some 13%, and more than half of households now owned a vehicle, which also goes to people being able to drive to the prison to visit their loved ones. But that's a different topic for another day. And of course, too, there's the increase in used car sales, so that the largest percentage of increase in vehicle registration was among people who were making less than $30 a week. But it's also important to note that as wartime industries are expanding, there is an increase of commercial trucks moving large quantities on highways, and that's going to be really important for 2 of the women whose stories I found in the archive. But aside from the larger context of roads and car ownership, What I'm really grappling with in this larger chapter that I write about what I call genealogies of escape and these kind of the intergenerational use of dogs is the simultaneous possibility for incarcerated Black women to use cars and highways subversively, and for those very cars and highways to become extensions of carceral surveillance and white violence. And so in thinking about this, I'll pair two stories together to give you a sense of the kind of vexed analysis I'm trying to work through. So in 1943, for example, there's an incarcerated woman named Sarah Johnson. She's escaped twice before from Julia Tutwiler. But this time she cuts a screen window in the cell block and she climbs over the fence and then she runs toward the road. So as with Gertrude Feeling, the acting warden sends for the pack of dogs from Draper. They track her to the highway, but then the scent stops. It was in the middle of the night by the time they get there. It's around 2 or 3 in the morning. So that when the warden records the escape, what he's recording is an inference. He's left to infer what has happened. And he writes, quote, "It is presumed that she was picked up by someone," end quote. And because of the road, it was further than she had ever made it before, such as when in 1942, the guards stopped her 6 miles from the field where she had been working. But then we know just a year after Johnson escapes that in Abbeville, Alabama, Reese Taylor was walking home from church when a group of white men pulled over, forced her into the car, and drove with their headlights turned off towards the woods and away from the main highway, and of course assaulted her. And then there's the Highway Patrol, which complicates this story even further. So since the 1930s, the governor's office, because these are different agencies kind of working, not always in tandem, but the governor's office in the 1930s begins to authorize the Highway Patrol to pick up incarcerated people who have not returned from their temporary paroles or who have been told to come back from the terms of their parole. So I already know that there's cooperation between state prison officials and highway patrolmen. But the statewide highway patrol posed a different kind of threat also to Black women making furtive passage, right? Because they not only tracked down people who ran away, but more broadly, they police Black drivers. And in this way, even if Black women managed to be picked up by a friend or a loved one, once in the car, they then faced the quotidian surveillance of the state's roadways. So for me, I see the road, especially at night, as cloaked in this uncertainty. So that escaping the highway patrol, like incarcerated 18-year-old Katherine Jones did in 1945, was to avoid the routine violence of modern ambulatory policing, even as it stoked small crises in prison oversight. And I see these small crises in the archive. It's when Viola Belton and Annie Pugh ran away from Julia Tutwiler in 1944, and they could not be tracked down by the dogs because someone passing in a car must have picked them up. It's in 1945, to go back to these commercial trucks, when Frankie Lee Downey and Mavry McRae ran away together from Camp Katona, where they were forced to wash laundry for the Jefferson County home. And they go in broad daylight and they hitchhike and get picked up by a packing house truck that takes them just north of Birmingham. Or it's in the winter of 1945 when 19-year-old Elizabeth Marshall, who had been put in solitary at Julia Tutwiler, climbs through a window and over the fence, and she takes a bus to Montgomery. So even as the gendered and racialized violence that took place in cars and on highways were powerful and nascent spaces of domination, Black women's subversive use of these technologies frayed the enduring ends of slave patrols. And I think frayed is a really operative word here. By using the same technology as state surveillance to undermine it, I see Black women's actions that had memorial, and this is a different part of my chapter where I kind of use the ex-slave narratives to think about memory in this case, but it also had material effects. So that while these radical moments of possibility, and here I'm really drawing on a lot of literature and Black feminist theory, did not eradicate nor abolish carceral surveillance, they took aim at a powerful and intergenerational tool of policing. And of course, this mattered both individually and collectively. And yet, as so many of us likely know who are either presenting or listening to the presentations, the use of dogs in policing and prison surveillance did not end at Highway's Edge in the 1940s. We know this from what happens a decade or two later. We know that Alabama state officials continue to deputize them as tools of incarceration and torture. We have the infamous photographs from Birmingham. And so the question that I attempt to answer at the end of this chapter is, what was it then for incarcerated Black women to challenge dog patrols, only to have police and prison guards repurpose and adapt this technology of violence? And a broader question that I think would be really interesting for us to think about together is, what was the significance of rupture if continuity in some form remained? And so my attempt to answer this question is what I'll leave you with today, is that, so despite the continuities and even evolutions in technologies of surveillance that survived the abolition of slavery, incarcerated Black women disrupted what white Southerners had for so long held as an inviolable tool of white supremacy. So even if these ruptures in surveillance, whether they were temporary or more permanent, did not prevent the future use of dogs, they were evidence of fugitive strategies that created new gateways to corporeal and geographic freedom. And in this way, incarcerated Black women's genealogies of escape, a term that I theorize in my dissertation as a whole, responded to the past by attempting to thwart the prison's literal invocations of slavery, because also there are ideological invocations of slavery. And so in these responses, Black women forged new possibilities that forced yet another reconfiguration of what Walter Johnson has called the carceral landscape. And I will leave it there.
Thank you. Justin.
Thanks, Pete, and thanks, Micah, for a wonderful talk, and Katherine. Micah, this panel was your idea a long, long time ago. So just thanks again for sort of sticking with it and keeping us together, and Katherine for joining. Met Katherine at the Southern in 2017, so it's been great to sort of see our work develop. Kat, thanks for agreeing to comment, and William, I actually look back, William offered feedback on our proposal to the Southern in 2019, so a million thanks there. I'm going to have 10 minutes or so towards a broad argument because I want to keep myself honest. It's something like this. The crises necessary to propel paramilitary state police reform after World War II grew from social conflict on roadways. And I think we're hearing here that, you know, roads are key pieces of state infrastructure, and the Jim Crow racial state is coming and deploying at different times to sort of guard, contain, protest on them, watch them carefully. In my book, I show that Mississippi's paramilitary police reform, and here I'm thinking of centralization, right, away from the sheriff, away from a local cop towards a state police, where you're getting military-style training and military-style surplus materiel. That paramilitary reform grew from the state militia, actually. So to Micah's point about continuity and rupture, the first militias chartered, state militias chartered in 1799. It's a settler militia with Mississippi Territory. 1877, there are laws passed to consolidate them after Reconstruction. 1890, again, centralized. Many of these sort of state reformers, white men, had roles in Indian removal in the 1830s and 40s, went on to fight in the Confederacy in the 1860s. And their last act in the 1890s is to sort of centralize the militia. One of those guys I'll mention is Stephen D. Lee. Stephen Lee was the first president of Mississippi State University, what we know it as today. He was also the first state historian of Mississippi. He said, quote, "The state militia is to the state what trial by jury is to the individual." He cited spasmodic disorders and anarchy, such as we have seen too often of late. This was 1895. Can these things be dealt with by a political sheriff in a medieval posse? He thought not. Justice bears the sword as well as the scales. The only thing that makes government respectable is the musket of the soldier. So they're not leaving any ambiguity here with what they're thinking. This impulse towards police reform, I think, really meant the maintenance of white supremacist wealth creation, economic growth, right? Keeping the disorder pinned down so that the economy can thrive. This is going to be used against an insurgent Black population in a state like Mississippi, and the extrajudicial white violence that the ruling class feared would undermine their growth economy. All right, so here I'm thinking of folks like Kimberly Johnson's reforming Jim Crow, Joseph Crispino's use of strategic accommodation, someone like Stephen Barry in the Jim Crow routine, and especially Nicole Siegel, whose work, Violence Workers, asks us to think of the police as always already military, right? This force for sort of military life in civilian life. But of course, standing to stop all of this constantly is the sheriff and the police force, right? They don't want this centralized police power. They don't want it to interrupt their clientelistic, paternalistic relationships in local economies, and they don't want to be challenged in their own sort of land grabbing schemes that comes out of the sheriff's officers such as that. And they will adamantly recruit sort of a PR campaign against centralization throughout this period, even calling the state police the Gestapo, famously after World War II. So three scenes that I've told you about: drunk drivers, cattle rustlers, and racial agitators. My argument to you today is that on the roadway, these three sort of criminals, right, that that the white ruling class makes, give this crisis for expansion, right? That we can overcome the sheriff and the local law enforcement mandate against state centralized policing and build it up. So first is 1938. That's where you get the Mississippi Highway Safety Patrol for the first time. We call this the state police. We call this the highway patrol. We call them the state troopers, right? Anyone who's grown up in rural places know the highway patrol. And in many ways, my research is sort of revealing why that is. This is a very particular rural type of policing. It's a patrol. So to Micah's point, it's calling itself the same thing that the slave patrol would have in the 19th century. There's the state troopers, which is sort of play on the state troops, which is what they called the militia in the earlier 20th century. And they're cloaking this sort of expansion in the language of highway safety and public safety. They create the Department of Public Safety in 1938. It's headed by Thomas Butler Birdsong Jr., who was a third generation militiaman whose great-grandfather was had a hand in Indian removal in Georgia, and whose grandfather was in the Civil War, right? Again, this generational legacy of military service. He trained at the Mexican border in World War I. He began his career in law enforcement in 1919 when he got back from World War I and effected a citizen's arrest on a black motorist in Clarksdale. He would rise to be, in fact, the chief of police in Clarksdale in the 30s. So, how did this militia force turn into a state police force? The state government had begun to use the National Guard riot squad to disrupt black-owned gambling districts. So places where gambling was allowed to occur under the table if you paid the sheriff enough money. The state begins to deploy forces, state troops, to go and bust that up, thinking here of Jackson's Gold Coast, a place on the Chitlin Circuit where people like Cab Calloway would come and perform. So already we're thinking of a force that can go across county jurisdictions, right, from one sheriff's jurisdiction to another, and disrupt the clientelistic corruption that is undergirding that. Governor Hugh White is the man who creates the Highway Patrol in 1938. He says very publicly that they're here to chase drunk drivers, right? The drunk driver, that most dangerous criminal of all, he says. Of course, they're doing more than that. The Highway Patrol is implicated in black discrimination from the very beginning, from, distributing driver's license, right? If you want a driver's license, you've got to go present yourself to the Highway Patrol. TRM Howard in Mound Bayou will famously call the Highway Patrol the Brutality Patrol, the Highway Brutality Patrol. So he had no illusions about it being a force for equal justice under law. But it was a highway patrol, and they were very careful to frame it this way. They really stayed away from language around it being a state police force. But this was a highway patrol that was actually trained by the Texas Rangers. At the border, Birdsong had made connections and networks with the Texas Rangers, and in 1938, he will bring the Texas Rangers to Mississippi to train these people in military tactics, he'll say. So you might wonder why DUI chasers need military training from the Texas Rangers. And I think we can see sort of two different ideas of what's actually going on here, appearance versus reality with Birdsong and the drunk driver panic. So second phase, second point I'll take you to is 1950 and the creation of something weird, the Livestock Theft Bureau, the Mississippi Livestock Theft Bureau. Here I think that the patrol begins to experiment with general jurisdiction, right? They've been very careful with the highway patrol, 50 men on either motorcycles or squad cars. They had to get rid of the motorcycles because they found out there were not enough paved roads, and you can't really drive a motorcycle down a dirt road, it turns out. But in 1950, they began to push the boundaries of this to where they can go onto county roads, these dirt roads, and that's, though, reserved for a very special type of state trooper, the livestock theft agent. Birdsong takes this idea from the Texas borderlands, where he trained these special rangers that were parts of Texas Rangers. Often they were cattlemen, ranchers, civilians who were recruited into doing this sort of work. Thinking here, of course, of the wonderful work of Monica Martinez. And in Mississippi, this work was done by the Mississippi Cattlemen's Association, a private agribusiness group that got to write the bill and wrote it so that they got to choose who these cattle inspectors would be that were going off and patrolling the countryside. So why beef? Why cattle? Why was it such a big deal? The price of beef was skyrocketing after World War II. One farmer noted in 1948 that he had profited $695 on the sale of one cow. Another quoted $1,200 in profit for the sale of one cow. These were massive sort of investments that they created a panic about trying to protect. You know, the thing where the road comes into the cattleman question, especially, is the use of the road to steal cattle, right? There's this massive fear that you can just pull up to a pasture, load up a truck with somebody's cows, and jet off before anyone can find you. And so it will lead, you know, to a PR campaign in very conservative newspapers like the Clarion Ledger in Jackson, where suddenly people who had been completely anemic to state power are in favor of it. They were prolific. They arrested 1,400 rustlers in their first 10 years. They claimed that there were a majority white rustler population that they were arresting, though I don't have the sources to sort of prove that. But they will very carefully stage a colorblind public relations campaign so that they will show themselves and take pictures of sort of saving cattle, saving livestock for black farmers as well as white farmers. So the third and the last moment I want to take you to is 1964. And this is the expansion of the highway patrol, the state police, this paramilitary police power in the form that we know it today around the direct action phase of the civil rights movement. Thinking of the road in Mississippi in the 60s, right? You can think of the freedom rides, right? Transporting the movement on buses into bus stations. 1961, during the freedom rides, the highway patrol will actually escort the freedom riders to Jackson, where they are promptly arrested and will eventually end up in Parchman Penitentiary. In 1963, it's Fannie Lou Hamer returning from a registration seminar in Septima Clark's Charleston, actually. She'll get back into her home county of Montgomery, or her birth county of Montgomery County, and be assaulted by John Lutellis Basinger, a highway patrolman, alongside Uvester Simpson, June Johnson, and N.L. Ponder. These are this is the incident that she talks about in her Atlantic City testimony at the DNC. But so in 1964, Paul Johnson Jr. becomes the governor, and he touts a very moderate, progressive message. He's going to use the state highway patrol to cut down on both black agitation on the roadway and importantly, white knight riding vigilante violence. Right? This is his promise. And he has a very moderate tone. In his inaugural address, he says, "We are Americans as well as Mississippians. Hate or prejudice or ignorance will not lead Mississippi while I sit in the governor's chair." Of course, this is coming on the heels of the Kennedy assassination that Katherine reminded us of, right? This language of hate was very present in the South, especially at this moment. But in March, it was really the specter of the Freedom Summer occupation of the South that drove Johnson to ask for an extended state police force, one that could go on any county road that it wanted to, anywhere, to patrol Black activists and white Klan activity. Using this language of disorder, troublemakers, property being under threat, and especially the idea that the federal government could impose its own brand of law and order if we didn't get it under control. So the legislature gave them everything, right? They had been completely against giving this carte blanche to the highway patrol, but they do that after 1964 with the understanding that it's on a 4-year repealer, right? So that they'll have to revisit it every 4 years to decide whether or not they actually want the highway patrol. But later in 1964, it actually makes a turn, and that repealer becomes less important. And I'm thinking here, of course, of the Freedom Summer murders, where it is actually the State Highway Patrol that aids the FBI in cracking the case. And so it will establish its reputation as being essential to the maintenance of good order in the state, regardless of what activists like Fannie Lou Hamer, T.R.M. Howard, and folks like that say. By 1980, and I'm wrapping up now, there were 800 troopers. Right, there were 100 in early 1964, tripled to 300 by the end of 1964. By 1980, there were 800 state troopers with a budget of $22 million. The 2022 budget is $240 million. So at each point, right, these crises on the road sort of breaking through and creating a foothold for the highway patrol, the state police power to not only just have a presence, right? We're not just talking about salary and like expanding the force, but a revolving in budget that we expect to grow at each step in the process. But I'll stop it there. Thanks again, everybody. Thanks for coming out, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Justin. William, we're ready for your comments.
All right, great. Thank you all so much for having me on the panel. It's really been a pleasure to read more about your work and engage. I'm going to skip sort of the more formal, rehashing of what you all just said that we might do in person and just sort of get to the meat of what I've got to say, I think. But one thing that I do want to observe is that I think this is really exciting. It's sort of combining these two emerging bodies of literature. One, obviously the carceral state, but then, race on roadways. We're seeing sort of an emergence of several different, not only histories in our literature, but even like in popular culture, with like Lovecraft Country and things like that, for example. People know what the Green Book is now in this country. And so I think this is really interesting that it's sort of marrying these two things and thinking about how the carceral state is taking place on roadways. I'm not sure who that is, but I'm going to start off with my comments about Katherine Bynum's work. And for all of you, I would encourage all of you to keep thinking more and more about, how your work engages with this carceral state literature. I think that one thing that's happening here is the way that the carceral state literature has been unwrapping is that, we have big, broad systems in prisons, but now this is literally what's happening sort of on the grassroots, everyday interactions of people, on roadways. But to get into Katherine's work, so one of the things that I thought was so interesting was that I didn't recognize the SNCC that you're talking about. So like the SNCC that you're discussing in Dallas in 1967 is so far away from the SNCC that we think of in 1960. And I think that it'd be really important they kick out white people in July of 1967, obviously. So I think like the literal timing of the SNCC founding in Dallas is really important. Is it before or after they kick out, white people? And how are they thinking about that? But it's also really interesting because they're working with presumably a bunch of white students also in the SDS. So to really tease out that relationship, I think, is going to be really important. And I think, basically what I'm asking is, what does that say about this branch of SNCC in Dallas? And what do they think about the role of white people in this struggle? At the same time, I'm interested in what exactly they're fighting against, because Dallas in 1967, yes, absolutely, the city of hate, and it's got to overcome this reputation. And there's all sorts of problems with policing and racism and the history of all of that. But like Dallas in 1967 is not what SNCC was facing in 1960. I mean, it's got desegregated schools. It's got Black people involved in city government, not, as mayor or whatever, but actively involved. It's not trying to crack open Jim Crow. It's a different era, not only in the South, but Dallas is a different place than, say, Jackson or Birmingham or some other place like that. So I'm really curious about what exactly their targets are and their strategies are to achieving the change that they want to see happen. And then with your second example with the grocery store protests, SNCC, early SNCC was so disciplined and so strategic in many ways and profoundly ambitious, right? That they were going to absorb punishment through this concept of redemptive suffering to end Jim Crow. So Jim Crow's essentially been, legally, we had the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. So their strategy to go into a grocery store and just throw shit off the shelves, for example, I'm wondering, what exactly are they doing? That's not going to generate the moral authority that the sit-in movement generated or that the freedom rides generated, and so on and so forth. And so I wonder, it almost seems like it's sort of a politically immature tactic, to be honest with you, because the optics of it are never going to get people in the middle on your side. I think they would actually do the exact opposite, even though it might have been somewhat cathartic to disrupt that business at that particular point in time, And then, I think so. My sort of bigger, broader question was, how do we evaluate civil rights organizations whose goals we might not often really fully understand? That's the thing that gets a little murky after the Civil Rights Act, right? When the whites only signs come down, then the goals, are a little bit more confusing, but then the tactics, do they really make sense? And I just wonder about, how do you position that precisely in this moment that it can sort of make sense about what exactly they want and how they go about achieving that. I'm gonna jump over to Micah. Micah, one of the things that I thought that really stuck with me that I think might not stick with everybody, but were some of the details of exactly what is happening here. And I'm thinking of literally how the dogs are trained, what types of dogs they're using, where do they come from, what are the strengths and weaknesses of different breeds? How does that fit into hunting culture or rural culture and training techniques that these dogs, have been undergoing for decades and decades? Presumably their bloodlines, go back to quite literally the antebellum era. So I was really interested in that. And I would encourage you to really think about that. So we really know exactly what people are up against as they're trying to escape from these dogs in these prisons. And then we also understand that sort of culture. I mean, if you're going to center dogs, let's really get into it. Maybe it's because I have a dog, but and I was also interested in the details of tracking. So with the roads becoming, so people get to a road and the scent goes dry. And I don't know much about this, but again, this is where the details get in. Is it harder to track a person across pavement than in a wooded area? And so if it is, then the person could, run 200 yards down the road, jump back in the woods, and all of a sudden they're almost in a whole different section of the forest. So I was really interested in the actual nature of how that worked out. I was also really interested in what the prisoners were wearing, especially what they were wearing on their feet, and how, the people that were escaping, but then also the people that were trying to catch them thought about that. I mean, obviously, we all have a sense of what prisoners are wearing now, and there's a reason for that. I would have to imagine that there's something similar happening there to prevent escape. I mean, certainly if somebody escapes, you can take their shoes, for example. That might, make it harder for them to move through the forest, obvious reasons, but then also easier for the dogs to track them. And then I was thinking conversely, what you said about people potentially being picked up by hitchhikers And I kept wondering, like, who in their right mind, if you're a Black person driving in the dark in the Jim Crow South, who in their right mind is picking up an escaped convict? I mean, if I was living in that era, I mean, the penalty could be imprisonment yourself, you know? So I'm kind of wondering about how that actually might have, you know, shaped out, especially in terms of what we're learning more and more, you know, as you cite in your paper about Black travel during the Jim Crow South. And I'm also interested in other forms of resistance, especially among female prisoners in Alabama. Perhaps that's something you talk about more in your larger work. But then also these connections between this era and the antebellum era. I would encourage you to keep exploring those. I don't really have a specific suggestion other than to think about resistance other than just escaping. You know, thinking of Tara Hunter's work, for example. But I thought that was really fascinating, some of those details about your work and what they mean. And then let me close with just talking about Justin. So one of the things I really like about this and that I really admire about how we're writing history now and doing public history now is we're finally naming names. It was always so unsatisfactory to me when I was in graduate school. I read a lot of brilliant work, and it was always like the nameless, faceless Klansmen, you know, that had no sort of background or context or anything else. And, you know, like you told us who the people were that assaulted Fannie Lou Hamer. Very few people, even those that know Fannie Lou Hamer's story very well, I think know that. And I think that's important, especially as you unpack their backgrounds. I was also struck by the selection process in that initial group, the people that trained at Camp Shelby. 1,330 people applied and only, 53 finished? So it was like a 4% acceptance rate from the application. So it was really hard to get in. And I wonder what that says about the unit. And then I was also curious about the relationship with the Ku Klux Klan in two different eras that you're talking about. Because we know that Klansmen during the era of Prohibition were deputized to fight bootlegging, you know, especially to go into Black communities, break up bootlegging. So, you know, I wonder if there's any way to track sort of what's happening there. But then conversely, in the 1960s, the state of Mississippi, as you said, you know, they're certainly worried about optics. And I don't think they really care that much about, you know, Black violence and things like that. But what they do care about is their perception to potential investors. They want to bring in factories, they want to bring in industry and so on and so forth. And so I wonder about this relationship between, you know, the state powers that be and this highway patrol and these like sort of wild-eyed Klansmen, you know, like the Samuel Bowers group, for example, that they got to really put a cap on. And so I really wonder more about those relationships. And I was curious if you could find more about maybe some of those details in the Sovereignty Commission. I wonder if the Sovereignty Commission is talking about those relationships, and especially as you have individual names that you can track. And then the final thing that I think is just so fascinating is this relationship with the local white police forces. You know, there's this sort of constant tension that I think you do a good job of alluding to, but not having the space here to really tease out. But I really wonder about what's going on with those. Like, what are the class issues? You know, obviously there's jurisdiction issues. I imagine that some of the local sheriffs are worried that the state patrol is going to start investigating their crimes too. So I was really struck by that. But I'll just stop there. But thank you all so much. It's really fascinating work. I'll hand it over to Kat.
Okay, thank you, William. Kat?
Hey, I don't know what name is showing, but I'm Kat Sharon.
Your name's showing.
Oh, okay. Again, I'm going to keep my comments short and just pose questions, basically. And what I like to do is kind of get all these papers talking to each other, right? And how insights that each of you are offering can maybe assist one of your peers on the panel. And I'm going to start with Micah, just because that's the order I went in. I really appreciate your attention to both the possibilities and the dangers of the roads. And I think that's worth saying again. And your insight about fugitive strategies that yielded new paths, quote, to corporal and geographic freedom, end quote, got me thinking about the mental cartographies that these women carried with them, right? For example, how many of those who successfully eluded capture had a familiarity with the county or the roads around the prisons? So was local awareness a necessary advantage, right? And how would someone who didn't have that navigate the chance of escape, right? And I also wonder, putting you in conversation with Justin, and because I just taught Carlin Forner's book this week, if what Justin says about cattlemen gaining political power in Mississippi and using it to expand the scope of policing, if that would apply in Alabama, which is turning to cattle, at least in Dallas County, that part of the Black Belt, as early as the 1940s, right? So is there a similar process that unfolds in relation to cattle? It might be similar, it might be different. I have no idea, but those were the questions I had. Justin, you're reminding us of the entire structure of the roadways, even something as mundane as getting a driver's license to meet the requirement to drive is racialized, discriminatory. It's also a source of revenue, right? And I was struck that the FBI assisted the cow police, right? But not it wouldn't protect civil rights workers, right? But it'll help the cow police. I basically have two questions for you. Do you think that Governor Johnson pioneered a local, meaning state, approach to law and order, ironically, to keep the feds out, right, of Freedom Summer, that would become more nationalized after Freedom Summer, this law and order discourse that emerges? Is he doing something that other people will look at and be like, oh, or even the federal government itself, right, in terms of jurisdiction and policing, even as he sounds like a moderate, right? And maybe that's why other people can look at it and adopt some of it. And then my second question, and I'd say why or why not? Is it specific to Mississippi, or not? My second question kind of deals with how Mississippi compares to other Southern states. People always say Mississippi is the worst, but we also know that white leaders share information and borrow tactics from each other. So do you have any sense of other Southern states developing similar policing strategies in this era in order to maintain white supremacy? And then Katherine, finally, the intersections in the short piece that I read are just brimming with possibility and really make me want to know more. One thing that occurred to me is that reading about Macmillan's harassment for distributing literature on street corners recalled the IWW for me in the West and made me think of like Joe Hill and all the folks who were arrested and put to death for distributing literature considered inappropriate. So I'm wondering if there's a longer kind of thread of that in your region as well. I didn't know why. I mean, I really wanted to know why. SNCC, what are they protesting by smashing this food? Why would you do that? But also, I think it's useful to think about how it relates to other Black Power era programs that actually focus on feeding people, right? And I'm thinking of like the Panthers breakfast program, just off the top of my head, right? So how that sits in relation to these things. And I think we also see a certain irony at work that applies to all activism, right? So on one hand, confrontation makes the activist work more visible. On the other hand, that makes them more vulnerable to policing. So borrowing a concept from Micah, I was thinking like, can these activists, do they attempt to create fugitive spaces beyond the arm of the law? And if they do, what ways would they do so? That's all I have.
Are you through?
I am through.
Okay, thank you. And thank everybody on the panel for being brief and brilliant and coming in on time. So we have a few minutes now for questions, and Mike has already sort of dealt with one, but we have one from Cindy Hamovich, and this is her question, mostly for the whole panel. Are these Southern stories, or do roads play a similar role in carceral history throughout the U.S.? Who wants to jump on that one?
I can put some stuff on the table, and this is actually plays into Kat's question really well too. In the South, I'm going to do sort of in the South, and then I'm going to make a really wonky connection. But so state highway patrols are sort of a later phenomenon in the South. I think they come, and Micah, you did a great job of sort of setting up the expansion of the concrete sort of roadway, the paved roadway. Mississippi is one of the last, like if not the last, to do it, to have a patrol. But certainly these guys are in the sort of reformist centralizers, state policemen are all in a network with one another. And most of them have a connection to the military through like the National Guard by this point. And they will maintain those relationships. I mean, in the 50s, Birdsong is being photographed with the Department of Public Safety chieftains in Texas. So still like they are maintaining that relationship. But, where I find highway patrolmen sort of doing work like this all over is wild. So if you read Robert Caro's book on Robert Moses, I mean, the state highway, the police, he's using the state police to, in his sort of work for eminent domain and, pushing those highways out through Long Island. They're showing up with him to do that kind of work. Even earlier in, around the turn of the century, Pennsylvania is one of the very first state police forces, and they're less highway patrolling, but they actually have their roots in the occupation of the Philippines, and the constabulary that the U.S. sort of creates in the Philippines is the model for the Pennsylvania State Police. So I would say that there is a counterinsurgent mentality that sort of accompanies the police tactics as approaches the road. That's what I think.
I would jump in and say that I think in terms of dogs, especially, one of the questions that I, answer in my larger chapter, which also I think goes to William's questions about how are these dogs being trained? What are the kind of genealogies of the dogs themselves? Is that why I invoked Walter Johnson at the end, his notion of the carceral landscape, which he terms during slavery, is because I see that the dogs are part of this very specific set of scripts and maneuvers that are established as a part of white surveillance during plantation slavery, and that continue obviously in different forms into the burgeoning carceral state. So that this is a Southern story especially in terms of my work, this is a very Southern story because I'm really interested in tracing the continuities, which isn't always similarity, but kind of the relationality between the construction of carceral space during enslavement, meaning the surveillance, the violence, the tools of surveillance and violence, and then how those tools are invoked and evolve in the context, in the kind of the very similar landscape. I think this is really significant. And this is why I actually turned to the Works Progress Administration's ex-slave interviews, because I think it's really interesting to ask the question of how are formerly enslaved people who might be witnessing or at least maybe hearing, they might have familial relationships with folks who are trying to run away from jails or police or prisons. How are they remembering what that landscape looked like during slavery? How are they remembering the dogs? And I just want to briefly, to answer William's question, in my chapter, I do talk extensively about the genealogy of dogs, because this is actually very vexed for white Southerners and for prison administrators in particular. They're always concerned about what breed of dog, and this kind of extends out what we know about, the twin deployment of dogs in settler colonial and chattel slavery regimes that begins in the Caribbean, is brought through Florida, and then comes into the South. And so I think, Alabama prison officials go to Mississippi to purchase dogs. They're interested in how can we reproduce our, bloodhounds. And in white newspapers at the same moment, and this is very particular to the South again, because it is framed by Uncle Tom's Cabin, that kind of cultural knowledge that is then being used as a framework to actually think about how dogs were used, at least among white Southerners during the antebellum period. And the argument is, are one, dogs vicious, and two, are dogs effective? And there is this kind of contradictory and vexed nature in those arguments that kind of creates this collusion between the past and the present.
Anybody else want to comment? Well, on the chat, there was this question to Micah from Trey Wellborn, which you sort of dealt with on that commentary thing. So I'll read the question so everybody that haven't seen it will see it. Extending upon the insightful comment from William Sturkey, in the larger project, have you explored the apparent parallels in language and structure between the prison announcements for escaped prisoners and fugitive slave advertisements from the antebellum era? Going to expand on that?
Yeah, that is actually one of the first things I noticed in the archive. Was I came across these boxes of escape notices that were eerily similar to runaway slave advertisements. And I was really interested in the ways that, the carceral state was, again, relying upon and building upon the ashes of slavery, and yet evolving at the same time. So I'll say a little bit more about that, because actually I have an entire chapter that is about escape notices, and especially I interrogate how escape notices, both during the carceral state and during the antebellum era, are really preoccupied and concerned with racial ambiguity and with shoring up racial binarism. Of course, we know in terms of the antebellum period, this is because Blackness becomes a metonym for bondage, a metonym for unfreedom. But also in the carceral state, I find that, in tracing this one particular racially ambiguous Black woman who ends up garnering a lot of political support through personal relationships with white men in the state, that white women kind of come together to organize against her, basically, because she's trying to get out of prison. And then she runs away. And she goes to Chicago, or maybe another city, it's kind of unclear. But I found that the advertisement written, which they send a telegraph, basically, to the Chicago PD, and they describe her in very particular ways. She can straighten her hair. Her skin is very light. She wears a lot of diamonds. And I thought immediately of Linda Brent, who we know through through Harriet Jacobs, often through Harriet Jacobs, but Edward Norcombe's runaway slave advertisement for Linda Brent has eerily similar language. And so in this way, in kind of that, my broader work, I'm thinking about how is this woman, Sarah Simmons, actually responding in similar ways to and anticipating the ways that she will be described and tried to be disciplined into a particular racial category. And then two, how is her escape in the context of the Great Migration changing the terms through which escape notices are wrought, and then, challenging them more broadly.
Thank you. We've got a bunch of questions here, and there are two from Brandon Jett. The first one I'll read, and then I'll read the second one too. How extensively did Southern criminal justice agencies in the period you cover look to northern or western states, or even the federal government, for strategies, techniques, equipment, and so on? And the second question is, on the other hand, were Southern approaches to criminal justice, policing, and so on that you identified being replicated outside of the region? So, well, you all know the answer.
I can again lay something out. Well, just on the FBI, that's the sort of the one that strikes most relevantly for me. J. Edgar Hoover I just refuse to touch it in the writing, but J. Edgar Hoover sort of looms over all of this. There are FBI agents at the training camp that William referenced, right, alongside Texas Rangers. Right? These G-men are actually lending their sort of support and training as well. And then in '64, especially, like Hoover is in very close contact with Paul Johnson. Will not for decades sort of will it become known just the role that the Highway Patrol had in like cracking the Mississippi burning case. But will very carefully like send letters thanking the governor for all of his support during the investigation. And I mean, that's the FBI is sort of there, and he's making clear at several points in time that he appreciates the role of the state police as opposed to sort of the sheriff in this more gothic form of law enforcement that the South is known for.
And I can add on to that as part of Justin's point about J. Edgar Hoover, right? A lot of what I'm focusing on, especially in the later parts of my book, are about the federal policing agencies, particularly the FBI, the COINTEL program, that is looking at all of these different Black nationalist groups of the era and are trying to neutralize them. And one of the things that stood out to me when I was researching this was the ways that Dallas was responding to a lot of SNCC's activities, which goes back to what William and Kat had made comments about. And so one of the things that I completely forgot to explain in my talk was that, so yes, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act had been passed, but there were these structural issues of racism in Dallas that still existed. And so what SNCC is aiming at doing is trying to remove some of that white control in Black communities. And so with the food smashing raid, this is a white-owned grocery store located in a Black neighborhood charging inflated prices for poor quality of food. And they see that as direct exploitation of Black people living in Dallas, and they want them gone. They want that the OK Supermarket to sell to Black residents and run it more as a co-op, more so than a grocery store in this Black neighborhood. And so when the food smashing raid takes place, Dallas really starts to panic. And what they do is they send officials, the mayor sends officials to Washington, D.C. to get an idea of what that city did after the MLK rebellions happened after his assassination in April of 1968. So they're going into full planning procedure mode because they have no idea how to handle this process. So Dallas is absolutely looking to other cities to see how it is that they can manage this problem, police these problems, and put those procedures in place. So I hope that answers both William and Kat's questions as well as Brandon's question.
And I'll jump in here and say, and the FBI was there in the 1930s as well, engaging with the Birmingham's municipal police. It's really interesting, actually, what happens around the time of New Deal funding. It kind of is an interesting parallel to Elizabeth Hinton's argument about what's happening during the Johnson administration. During the New Deal era, there is a huge influx of funding from the federal government, at least what I can see in Birmingham, which allows the Birmingham Municipal Police to not only look to the FBI, they bring in people to train them to take more massive amounts of fingerprints. They buy radio-equipped police cars, which changes the kind of cartography of the city in terms of getting to William's question, the twinned vulnerability of non-incarcerated people in the free world, having incarcerated people come into their space. And they also make comparisons meaning the Birmingham City Police are making comparisons between themselves and London and New York. They see themselves as being part of this vanguard of modern policing. And one of the most important components of this, particularly as I'm trying to kind of map these fugitive geographies, is that they are now creating patrols that go constantly, obviously in predominantly Black neighborhoods in Birmingham. And because of the radio equipment that is coming from federal funding, that is coming from tactics that they see as being imbricated in these cosmopolitan spaces, they are able to then quicken the rate of communication about people who are trying to run from the police. And this also, what this actually ends up doing is it creates further cooperation between municipal police and prison guards and wardens, which before this is kind of halting and communication is somewhat, disjointed. But now with radio equipped police cars, this really, I kind of chart how this is really changing not only the geographies we see in terms of the carceral state, but also the stakes of people hiding, incarcerated people who run away. And so some of my archives that I'm dealing with is Black people who have folks hiding in their loft and then they go and turn them in because of the serial search and seizure of Black homes in the South that we know has its roots in the antebellum South, but also are evolving alongside of these kind of modernizing policing techniques.
Thank you. William asked a question, but I'm not sure if Katherine answered it all. And his question was for her to expand a little more on the representation of Black power SNCC tactics. William, do you want to ask more, or has she addressed it?
Yeah, I think that Katherine addressed it. I think probably like Kat, I really understand exactly where they were going with that particular tactic, but that makes a lot more sense. And it also makes me think of, SNCC in other areas was organizing co-ops that were trying to feed, clothe people, give them jobs. And that was where the overlap of SNCC and Black power, I think, was really productive in a lot of poor Black communities.
Well, I don't see any new questions here. Do any of you have any final comments about the session? And I'll just say that in my opinion, it was a really good session. I think everyone who attended learned a lot. I mean, it's by young scholars, which makes me smile that the profession is in good hands. And the commentators, of course, were erudite in their vast knowledge. So I don't have anything negative to say about it. It was a really good session. But does anybody have anything else to add?
I just want to echo, Pete, that I think it's really exciting. And I know that, Justin mentioned or you mentioned in the intro that Justin's book's going to come out with UNC Press. And I'm really looking forward to all the work that, because I know this is just a sliver of broader projects too. So yeah. I'm really excited by everything that we've heard here today.
Yeah. Well,
as am I.
Well, with that, I wish we could all go out for a bowl of chowder, but we're not in New Orleans. So I'll just end the session and thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody, so much.
Thank you. Thank you.